Hello, and this is a rant. Normally I would post a video like this to the Zero Books channel, which you can find just by searching it here on YouTube, on my Monday Theorizing with a Hammer. But this isn't that coherent, and it's also not necessarily appropriate for Zero Books. After all, insulting your audience is probably not the thing you should do. I've been stuck between two narratives lately, and both of which have some truth to them, and both of which are utterly distorting. One is that if you scratch most leftists, what you find is a Democrat. That the radical critique they author is not really a radical change of society. And historically speaking, since probably the 1920s, and definitely since 1936, this is true. The history of the aligning of the socialist movement and the populist movements, both of which had strong flaws, in America anyway, in the United States and Canada, in Anglo-America, funneled into progressivism as the Great Depression hit. Now, the Great Depression was interesting in that because of changes after World War II and the quote post-war society, more than in the Great Depression itself, you saw the working class be flush with cash. It was relative if you were the right people. And even the wrong people were flush with cash comparatively to before, just not as much. This was especially true in the United States, but it was true in the Anglo-American world in general. Now, we can make a lot of hay of this, but this also meant that progressivism's hostility to capitalism and Fordist modes of production was just not there. And it wasn't there with the workers either, except in the areas where automation started pushing the workers out of production altogether. And recently I watched Adam Curtis's Emotional History of the Modern World, which is a mess that I'll talk more about on a symposium tomorrow. This being held in Dublin, Ireland, and Zoom's going to make that possible. And what I noticed with that is that there is very little, cohesiveness other than this idea of individualism versus collectivism. And so what you see, not that the individual or the collective are invalid abstract conceptions, although, if I'm strictly speaking, a collective is a projected imagined whole, as opposed to an aggregate, which is the emergence of a system out of the interactions of individuals. Neither one of which has singular agency, but one of which has an imaginary, and the other of which is real, in so much that it emerges from the seemingly chaotic interactions of a lot of different people at once. And similarly, individualism is one of these things where we're all individuals, and yet the very idea of our identity is predicated on differentiation from someone else and also acceptance by them. And so we tend to think of things as a way to differentiate ourselves, but also accept the general framework of, the habitus, the culture of the people who are we around. This is natural to social mammals. It's probably not even unique to humans. But when this gets further cut off from any material, and I say material here meaning things that you do in the physical world, which make an near immediate change in the way that you build something, social project, whether it be a business, a social movement, whatever. And notice here that I'm being very broad on purpose, where you have a mission, these tendencies to become, to play off this binary between the collective and the individual leads people to adopt pseudo stances. When I say pseudo stances, that maybe that's fair. That implies that there's some kind of real stance that you could take, but it leads in a bunch of what has been somewhat ruined by conservatives, but comes from an idea of cultural signaling, where you signal your virtue, and then it also leads concurrently to vice signaling or counter virtue signaling. The thing is, though, those narratives are constrained by the popular narrative that's going on, whether it's truly a manifestation of what is materially happening or not. And this leads to a lot of stuff. So that thing I started with, when you cut a Democrat, when you cut a leftist, you often find a Democrat. There's historical reasons for that. In the United States, or you find a liberal if you're in Canada. Um, you find a progressive, you know, who is not as opposed to capital as a radical populist and socialist adoptive rhetoric may incline. And this problem is not new. The idea that all someone will throw out all the Marxists have been petit bourgeois intellectuals since the 1920s. One, most of those people use petit bourgeois to mean not a union collective identity worker in a factory or mine, which isn't even the Marxist definition of worker, by the way. It's part of it, but it's not the only one. But that was the collective image for the first half of the 20th century. At this point, that's nostalgia. That's not what the working class is anymore, particularly not in the developed world. But beyond even that problem, you have another one. The other problem is that this counter narrative, this counter signaling, actually often inverts the entire spectrum. So where to differentiate yourself from the DSA, you take ridiculous Grover Fern notions of Stalinism. To differentiate yourself from all those secret, bad, petite bourgeois liberals who talk about how awful liberalism is, whatever that means at this point. Most people can't even define liberalism coherently. It's obviously as both an idea and a material project degenerated despite its hold on the imagination. What you find is that when you cut the people counter signaling them as the true Marxist, often you just find a Republican. Someone who thinks that nationalism and reshoring jobs is going to save us all from competition, that any of this could have been avoided. Now, you may have your critiques of Marxism, and you may have your critiques of leftism and rightism, Democrat, Republican, or whatever, Labor, Tory, conservative, liberal, if you're in Canada. But most of what you're doing is counter signaling, particularly when you're relying on people who are weirdly obsessed with U.S. politics but don't live in the U.S., yet they're always talking about the greatness of the American worker, which is not of their society. That, however, is just one form of what I like to call the mutually constitutive ideological death spiral, where the signaling and counter signaling leads to a negative dialectic or a emergent identity or a bunch of bullshit. All right? One side counter signals the other in a bunch of twins. They adopt frameworks ad hoc to justify their counter signaling and to not deal with the material forces to which they don't control. I'm not saying you have to be beyond left and right, because you can't. Those are relative terms in a society, and since they're relative, they have very little meaning but a lot of orientational force. You might not think of yourself as leftist or a rightist and might find yourself on any side of those equations at any given time. And no, I think that a Marxist is necessarily a leftist, at least in the contemporary leftist sense, as degenerated as that term can be. But I also don't think loudly proclaiming to the heavens that you're beyond the left of capital, beyond this, beyond that, actually means that you are. Left communism, for example, was left official communism in the USSR and in the Asiatic third world, in quotations, that's what they call themselves, socialist countries. It was also differentiating itself from the left opposition, which was mainly of Trotskyism. It was a minority position at all times, but at least it made sense when there was societies that openly claimed to be getting beyond capital through non-capitalist means. Even today, socialist countries think that the market socialist requires a capitalist developmental period, which ironically has meant that societies that did not have a strong proletarian or bourgeois um, mode of production within its nation, both in China, Russia, and a lot of East Asia, actually developed those forms of production through socialism to get through something beyond it. Now, that transitory dialectical logic you may or may not believe in, and it obviously seems stalled today. But it makes things like arguing about whether or not China believes it is socialist or believes it is capitalist somewhat irrelevant, but also this idea of true capitalism or socialism becomes somewhat of a farce. What does it even mean now? After all, these countries are part of the same production system as the capitalist world, exist in the world market, and sell in a world market and are totally dependent on it. So much for the world revolution, right? And that lack of feeling of internationalism leads people to focus on progressive policies that they think could bridge their own countries into socialism, but without often dealing with the fact that a lot of what they're doing has very little clear definition and seems to be largely ad hoc related to their position within our social strata. And I say social strata on purpose. The people Cadner signaling them for the working class, yelling this, that, and that about this, picking up largely conservative arguments or even anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from the 50s, will often do so under the guise of true Marxism, even though they're actually replicating James Burnham and people who actively renounce their Marxism and even went so far as to be diehard anti-communist, anti-Marxist. But the frustration stands to reason for every time you see someone who says ACAB and yet also starts calling for the police to enforce domestic terrorism laws. It's hard to see any coherence there. When you see people who are claiming that they are the post-left and the real Marxist while spreading um, class analysis based on Max Weber, Michael Lind, or Peter Turchin explicitly, all of whom explicitly are not Marxist, and some of whom explicitly posit themselves as a more coherent alternative to Marx, and in the case of Burnham, a more coherent alternative that was actively anti-Marx, will cry wolf when you call them out on this and say you're just trying to associate them by linking names together, even though you're citing their own work and proving that they're not using a Marxist framework. So if your true inner core of who you are determines whether or not you really believe in ideology, then yes, sure, anyone can be anything. Because if I believe I am a Zayadi Shiite Muslim, then I, of course, am, even if I have none of the dogma, none of the cultural habitat, none of the cultural accoutrement, none of the context, and none of the theology. But if my inner belief is what counts, then of course it is true. Come on. This is pathetic. Hold people to what they say they are. But it's not just these post-leftists who do that. Most of the quote-unquote socialists also ignore all the parts of Marx they don't like or don't want to deal with. And let's be honest, most of them haven't read the key text anyway. They're reading commentary on commentary on commentary, and in each time pitched for their particular social milieu that have very little to do with what they're doing. I mean, what most of the people in America are doing without realizing it is the edgy retakes of Harrington and Max Shachtman are being resold as a guide to Marxism, both of whom were funneling people into the Democratic or sometimes even the most right wing of the Democratic and ended up defecting to the Republican Party. And it's not just in the US, it's just that's the context that I know the most. This is mutually constitutive counter-signaling, and if you participate in a social milieu, there's very little way out of it. You need a project, and without that project, you're going to be basically doing terror management, and if you don't know what that is, you should look it up. And on that note, I'm kind of telling you all that maybe you shouldn't listen to what people say they believe and look at how they function. And if that's the case, very few people who say they are socialist have anything to do with socialism, regardless of whether or not they're leftist, post-leftist, DSAs, or Marxist-Leninist, or whatever. Ultimately, these things aren't just about ideology. You need to think clearer, and if you can't, get out of the way.